Societies have always openly disdained the homeless and less fortunate. Even at a glance, we can see the obvious contempt and facets of our own economy, legislature, and social constructs. Our entire society at its core is designed to make life uncomfortable for the poor, whilst absolving those at the top from their feelings of guilt. But what if this idea goes beyond the intangible? What if it's all around us? What if the train station you use for your daily commute, something as innocuous as a public restroom, or even the park bench you occasionally sit on during lunch hour, all do a small part in maintaining this distance between the haves and have-nots? I'm talking about hostile or quote defensive architecture, and if you're not familiar, you really should be, because it's now seemingly everywhere, especially if you live in a city. Just look at New York, for example. In the past decade, the city has been turning up the dial and weaponizing the design of their public spaces against the homeless.
And what happened in the winter, because you have a lot of homeless people in New York City, because of both mental illness and also the fact that a shitty studio apartment can cost upwards of $2,200, is you had people that would sleep on these grates so that they wouldn't freeze to death. What they do is they put this stuff over it so that it's actually painful. Now you can't lie down on this to sleep, because not only is it a metal grate, but it also sticks up in certain sections. Like you can see this one sticks up higher than some of the other sections, so that if somebody were to lie down on this, they would actually feel physical pain.
Some of the more subtle iterations of this have included installing large metal bars on public benches, or making them so shallow that nobody can lay down or even loiter on them comfortably for longer than a few minutes. Some New York City subway stations and bus stops have even done away with public benches altogether in favor of leaning benches. And like I said, these are subtle versions of defensive architecture. There are far more egregious versions of this in New York City alone. For example, the strange installations over subway ventilation covers and storm grates on sidewalks in Queens. The city claims them to be aesthetic benches that facilitate public rest, as well as fulfilling the primary purpose of your average subway ventilation grate. But they're not aesthetically pleasing, and because of their warped design, they're not comfortable to sit on either. So what do they really accomplish? Well, heat rises from these ventilation systems, and if you were living and sleeping on the streets, you might want to lay on top of one of these regular flat grates for warmth, especially through the cold winter nights of New York. With this new design, that would be impossible, because it seems the city would rather see the homeless population die of hypothermia under a bridge and out of sight than staying warm and alive on a sidewalk, but closer to those of us with high economic status. But this is just one specific exemplification of countless egregious instances of city planners designing modern architecture against the homeless. If you walk through the streets in any given first world city, you might notice large metal spikes on windowsills or doorways meant to deter loitering, a random assortment of boulders or a dense pallet of small bumps inconveniently placed under a bridge, fencing around a source of heat, and public resting areas which are divided into segments too small for average adult frames. These are all proof of the same concept. Governments are more concerned with burying the image of poverty rather than solving it. They believe if homelessness is out of sight from the public, it's completely out of mind, and by forcing these people to retreat to less desirable areas where public spaces are less hostile, they believe they're creating a better experience for the upper class who live in wealthy areas. And this is nothing new. The idea of hostile architecture as we know it today can actually be traced back to the aftermath of the 1848 Workers' Revolution in Paris. During the Workers' Revolution, the proletariat blockaded the streets with various furniture and supplies to their benefit, which made navigating the streets difficult for the French military. So when the streets were redesigned, Paris's narrow streets were replaced with wide boulevards and open space. This would then prevent citizens from creating blockades in the event of a future rebellion. Now let's talk about something cool today. Have you ever wanted a personal night sky in your room? Well, let's dive into the Galaxy Projector and see what it's all about. If you've ever been thinking of adding a little something special to your space, then this is exactly the kind of lighting you need. It will transform any room into a planetarium and give it a truly unique look and feel. But not only that, it's also a smart device. So let's look at some features. First off, its RGB colors, brightness, rotation, speed, on and off timers, and many more are fully customizable. Just grab your phone, and with this app, you can change everything and make it truly yours. Do you love using Amazon Alexa or Google Assistant? Well, the Galaxy Projector is on your team. Just say the word and it obeys, from switching on to changing modes. Complete hands-free magic. And guess what? It's energy efficient too, so you can enjoy your personal Galaxy without worrying about your electricity bill skyrocketing. So for those who appreciate good tech, this is for you. The Galaxy Projector is a modern gadget with timeless appeal, so get your projector today by clicking the link below. It's a fantastic Christmas gift that's sure to delight, and use my discount code MOON to get 15% off. In 1980, Langdon Winner, a political scientist, recounted a fascinating yet unsettling account of American urban planning, where he shed light on the bridges spanning the parkways connecting New York City and Long Island, which were intentionally designed to produce a specific social outcome. These overpasses were notably lower than usual, with some barely reaching a height of 3 meters from the curb. And this was not a mistake. This deliberate architectural peculiarity was the brainchild of Robert Moses, a man responsible for numerous public renovations in New York throughout the previous century. Moses, cognizant of the fact that low-income communities heavily relied on public transportation, constructed these bridges to dissuade impoverished individuals from utilizing the parkways. By preventing buses, which stood at a height of 4 meters, from passing beneath the bridges, Moses effectively confined the economically disadvantaged within the city limits. Meanwhile, the more affluent, who predominantly drove automobiles, enjoyed unrestricted access to these roads. And rather incredibly, Moses' planning was not widely recognized as discriminatory during his lifetime, which he dedicated to designing sadistic dystopian ways of pushing the less well-off. Drivers using the roads were oblivious to any significant details, as the bridge's seemingly harmless design concealed their nefarious purposes, allowing these qualities to fade into the background. Winner's Point was as poignant as it was profound. Even the most seemingly banal aspects of the landscape can be powerful tools in the hands of the politically motivated. Enduring constructions made from steel and concrete can covertly uphold systematic prejudices. Moses' influence over New York City's physical and political systems is a fascinating and illustrative example of this trend, demonstrating how devious designs can shape political arrangements for generations. Hence the coining of the earlier mentioned term, hostile architecture. Across the Western world, local governments use a whole host of perverse methods to prevent certain communities access to public space. Part of a subversive subculture, skaters more than most value freedom. The elites obviously don't. They value control and risk management. And skateboarding is actively discouraged through the use of pig ears and surfaces that can be used for grinding, causing skaters to lose balance. Additionally, flat and slope surfaces that are typically used as ramps are often segmented and depressed, making it impossible for skaters to cruise. While this type of hostile architecture has been criticized for discriminating against skateboarders and teenagers, it is most controversial when it comes to the homeless. Areas where rough sleeping is common are often covered in spikes or sharp stones, making it impossible to lie down. Covered spaces are also made unattractive to those seeking shelter. It's unclear whether or not these measures actually prevent skateboarding or rough sleeping, as hostile architecture is said to displace behavior rather than prohibit it, forcing targeted communities to move to other areas of the city. But it is important to note that being homeless or a skateboarder is not a crime, yet both are treated as such. I mean, just look around you. Hostile architecture or anti-homeless architecture is everywhere. Those slanted benches at train stations or bus stops may have caught your attention. Have you tried to sit on one? If so, your chances are you found yourself sliding off. And this is all by design. These benches are intentionally designed to be unsuitable for sitting, and in the case of homeless people, for sleeping. Oh, and those armrests. They have nothing to do with providing comfort for your weary arms. Although seemingly harmless at first glance, these armrests serve a specific purpose of preventing individuals from sleeping on benches. In recent time, there has been a surge in the popularity of benches that feature imprints or grooves to indicate designated seating areas. And so we have all these preventative measures, but nothing to actually get to the root of the problem. And by controlling public spaces, governments can control public behavior. Just recently, a new law in France now imposes fines on homeless individuals for loitering. The authorities argue that this legislation is intended to combat the abusive occupation of public space. The law specifically prohibits sitting or laying down in a way that obstructs the movement of pedestrians or traffic. But what are these people to do, and where are they to go then? Contrary to popular belief, many of the homeless are not mentally ill, delinquent junkies, or at least they weren't before they found themselves on the street. The vast majority of them, it seems, simply just can't afford to pay rent anymore. This is not true just in France, but also in the US. And to compound matters, the elites in their modern-day ivory towers equipped with state-of-the-art security systems couldn't care less. Why would they? After all, for them, this system is working as planned, or should I say, as designed. And this philosophy is very important to understand here, not only when it comes to understanding how the governments and elites use architectural design to mask their ongoing disposal of the homeless from cities, but also when it comes to silencing the voice of the masses. Because when the public spaces are riddled with spikes, uncomfortable steel bars and padlocks and bathrooms, homeless people aren't the only ones being made uncomfortable. These elements make it difficult for everyone to hang around a space for long periods, which inevitably acts as a deterrent for large protests and gatherings. As a protester, it might be easy to lose steam if you have to stand or sit on the ground for days on end to fight your cause. Hostile architecture is just an unhandled way for the elites to control the masses' behavior. It is the ultimate dystopian dream. This is why communists have always made buildings so ugly. When you look at Romania and Bulgaria and compare their old societies and compare their old architecture to what was built during their communist eras, and you can see just how much these communist dictators wanted to control the masses through buildings. Viewed through another lens, the master-slave dynamic becomes more akin to an owner-animal dynamic. After all, many of the products in modern-day hostile architecture started out as measures to prevent certain animals from resting. Take spikes on windows, for example. For decades, even centuries, they have been installed on windows and walls in urban areas, primarily to discourage birds from perching on them. In recent times, however, there has been a growing trend of installing spikes on ground-level windowsills as well, aiming to discourage individuals from sitting or seeking shelter, treating human beings like pigeons. As more and more, we're starting to see more of these spikes on pavements to prevent the poorest of individuals from resting, always positioned strategically around entrances, beneath bridges, and in other protected locations. The message is clear. Your value is the same as a lowly pigeon, and you don't belong here. Even plants are being used with the purpose of discouraging homeless individuals from ever seeking shelter by depriving them of a clear space to rest on the ground, which is a nightmare in places like New York and Chicago for these people when winter is particularly brutal. So the homeless often congregate around gates to keep themselves warm, or at least they're used to. Today, fence gates are now implemented as a measure to prevent individuals from gathering around them for warmth. Not only do these people lack shelter, they also lack any way to actually keep themselves warm, putting themselves at risk of hypothermia in the cold, snowy winter nights. In November, San Francisco, contender for the capital of America's homeless crisis, took radical action, cleaning up several well-known homeless encampments in preparation for the visit of China's leader Xi Jinping.
San Francisco cleared out homeless camps specifically for this week's summit. Several world leaders, of course, are joining Presidents Biden and Xi in San Francisco for that summit. Over the weekend, city officials reportedly cleared out areas of the city occupied by homeless camps and public drug markets, some now questioning why now instead of months ago.
Now, San Francisco has infamously been plagued by drug abuse and homelessness. In fact, it might have ruined the city, as you can walk along the streets and find putrid shit at a regular occurrence, surrounded by packs of needles everywhere. And Gavin Newsom, the slick-haired governor who some could argue represents everything wrong with modern-day America, acknowledged that the effort was made to create a positive impression for other visiting leaders, like one of the world's most brutal, authoritarian dictators, Xi Jinping. And so in just a few days, to appease the Chinese government, the city cleaned up 7 intersections and south of Market neighborhoods, leaving many incredulous citizens wondering why similar efforts had not really been made earlier. They've been having this problem for years, and suddenly, just like that, it was gone. The cleanup made multiple hotspots unrecognizable. Newsom defended this decision, stating that officials had recently raised the bar for Xi, not for the American people. That's right, the elites will raise the bar for other elites, but not for everyday tax-paying citizens. They'll raise it for dictators and communist authoritarian 1984 regimes, but not Americans. They could fix the problem, but for some perverse reason they chose not to. And the reason they'll often give for this is because of the cost. The Department of Housing and Urban Development estimates that the cost of eradicating homelessness in the United States would cost $20 billion. And while this may seem like a substantial figure, it is important to remember that the US Congress has, to date, directed more than $75 billion in assistance to Ukraine. And as the war goes on, we can expect this figure to raise astronomically. And that's not to say Ukraine should never receive any support. It's to say that elected officials should, first and foremost, be dedicated to helping their citizens first. This is the most important thing. And whilst $20 billion might seem like a lot of money, the expenditure on gym memberships in the United States exceeds $35 billion per year. Although you would know this probably from looking around. Last year, the US government spent $876 billion on the military. In other words, the homeless crisis could have been solved 43 times over, but instead the industrial military complex takes place. And if that's not enough to make your blood boil and head spin, cities are spending even more money criminalizing and displacing homeless individuals, when in truth, it would actually be far more cost-effective to provide them with housing. The expenses associated with anti-homeless measures, including hostile architecture, are estimated to be over $31,000 per person per year. In contrast, the annual cost of providing supportive housing is only 1/3 of this cost. But instead of putting out the fire, the US government, like many other governments around the world, instead chooses to pour more gasoline on the flames. The US is the wealthiest nation on earth. It has the capability to provide shelter and basic needs to every individual. As I speak, there are at least 582,000 homeless people in the US. Many of these are elderly, and it's a huge growing problem. By 2030, the number of homeless over the age of 65 will have tripled. Instead of being safe and sound, the people who built the US could soon find themselves on the streets of it. What we are witnessing here is a hollowing out of the middle class, with more and more people who once occupied relatively safe positions in society being thrown into the pits of despair. Scared, alone, hungry and cold, these people will be left to perish on the streets, while the ruling class watch on, yet again, with a mix of amusement and utter contempt and ignorance. Today, half of Americans have zero savings. 61% of US citizens are living paycheck to paycheck, 59% are just one paycheck away from being homeless. At the same time, those in power are becoming increasingly more powerful and increasingly richer. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is just like in 1789, fast becoming a gaping chasm. One assumes that the madness can't go on forever, something must give here. Then again, it's also possible that those in power, if left unchallenged, will only serve to make us weaker. The world is changing, and not really for the better. And so every time you walk around a city like New York, Chicago, or even London, really take a look at the designs around these cities, and in many ways you'll soon see that the cities you live in are anti-human by design.